Surely more than one of you this morning thought, I didn't know we had a Saints Peter and Paul Day. Well, I guess you do now, right? In fact, some of you have noticed in your Cranberry worship books, at the very front of them, there's on page 15 to 17, there's a whole list of all the saints' days and festivals in our Lutheran church year calendar. And some of these days are usually celebrated on a Sunday like Reformation Sunday or All Saints Sunday, but others only get celebrated when they happen to fall on a Sunday, such as today's celebration of Saints Peter and Paul. And for us, with St. Peter as our namesake, well, maybe it's a good idea to always celebrate St. Peter's Day each year, something to think about for another time. But these holy days, these holidays that rotate through the days of the week, they give us an opportunity for a fuller, richer reading of the Bible, for reflection on the lives of holiness and encouragement for the rest of us, an opportunity to root ourselves and our faith in the historical, physical, existing, real world. And so it is today with Saints Peter and Paul, the two most consequential apostles of Jesus. In fact, it seems that St. Peter's ministry was primarily located on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean Sea. Eventually, he ends up in Rome under the Emperor Nero, perhaps after stopping in Corinth, Greece. And St. Paul famously traveled, it seemed, from one end of the Mediterranean to the other, perhaps as far as Spain, but definitely including what we know today as Turkey and Corinth, Greece, until he as well ends up in Rome and is also executed by Nero. And while the two men famously had their differences, right, Galatians chapter 2 lays that out, a pretty straightforward reading of their work in the New Testament shows broad agreement about the gospel. And the book of Acts even records similar miraculous events in both their lives. And yet, from the biblical information, neither man seems particularly impressive in his stature or his status, such that their influence could be chalked up to charisma or largesse. Something else must have made the difference for them. Now, St. Paul reminds us in 1 Corinthians that God chose what is foolish in the world to shame what is wise, what's unimpressive and insignificant to shame the have-it-alls and the know-it-alls among us. And so with our theme of unorthodox wisdom, we've spent a few Sundays examining how conventional wisdom, everyday thinking, sophisticated analysis just doesn't cut it in spiritual matters. Whether it's trying to build our way up into heaven, or trying to know God by our own reason, or seeing Jesus around crazy people, or just trying to hang on to what we've got. Society's strategies just aren't smart. Cultural orthodoxy always comes back around to saving yourself with your own best efforts. In fact, sometimes it even tries to convince us that's what faithfulness is. Taking what God makes possible and then really going and doing it for yourself for real. Or even to put it more simply, looking out for good old number one. That's exactly the opposite of what we see in our Bible lessons today. St. Peter finds himself in prison about 10 years after Jesus' ascension in Pentecost. St. Paul finds himself at the end of his life, having spent the last couple of years imprisoned, about 30 years after Pentecost. In fact, just before his ascension, that's the gospel story, Jesus tells Peter to feed his sheep because of Peter's love for him. Jesus also warns Peter that he will be imprisoned and eventually executed as well. In fact, both Peter and Paul are executed, as we mentioned, under the Emperor Nero 30 to 35 years after that first Christian Pentecost. And in the meantime, Christianity spreads from Jerusalem to Samaria to the ends of the Roman Empire already in 30 years. In fact, it's hard to imagine that this could have occurred if the apostles were in fact worried about hanging on to keeping what they had. In fact, it seems that they all have quite adventuresome lives by orienting themselves to something greater, fuller, deeper, higher than one more payday, one more vacation, one more purchase, Or as that song by Midland goes, one more round. But this isn't new information to us as such, right? Success and security in one area requires the resources that could have been used in other areas, right? Cavemen figured that out. No, what's different for us to consider is the wisdom that faithfulness, that being a fully devoted follower of Jesus, right? That is the greatest success that brings the greatest adventure to us. Now you can see on the screen the little sermon teaser or tagline, this idea of voluntary self-sacrifice, a phrasing that we can pick up from Jordan Peterson. But question number 4 on your pink study and share insert, so let you go just a little deeper here. Well, maybe if I can grab mine. Anyway, on these in your bulletins, right? Number 4 lets you go a little deeper with this idea. But the idea of voluntary self-sacrifice is built right into our church building. From the way you come in, immediately oriented toward the altar, to how you come up to the altar, both as the service moves in that direction, but as you also move in that direction to receive Holy Communion. To how the altar is placed here at the highest point in the building where it belongs, as your attention is raised up from yourself to higher things. And as your eye and your attention continues up, you see this famous bit of stained glass there in the oculus, right? Well-known image. That's what the color was, round windows. Christ in Gethsemane was painted about 1890 by Heinrich Hoffmann, and in the days before strict copyright enforcement, replicated across the land. In fact, I believe our other stained glass windows, at least the ones with figures of Jesus in there, are copies of his work as well. But this episode of Jesus' life, often called the agony in the garden, Luke chapter 22, Jesus famously prays, "Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done." Echoing exactly how he taught the disciples to pray in the Lord's Prayer. Now, certainly a kind of mealy-mouthed, quiet and desperate, fatalist way to pray, "Not my will, but thy will be done." Surely that exists. But that's not what's going on in Luke 22 or intended in this artwork or its placement in our church. And look, Jesus' face is not downcast and gloomy like Eeyore the donkey. He's looking up, symbolically up toward heaven, toward what's important, toward his Father. And of course, we must do the same. And then Jesus says, "Not my will, but thy will be done." That is, his will is subordinated, offered up, sacrificed freely, willingly, voluntarily for the sake of the Father's own will. Now, of course, we know what happens. Jesus gives his life for the taking away the sins of the world, including yours and mine, innocently suffering and dying on the cross, shedding his holy and precious blood, and thus fulfilling the Father's will. That is, human creatures and all creation be reconciled to him through forgiveness, that they be made new through the power of Jesus' own resurrection to new life. In the gospel, we heard Jesus ask St. Peter, "Do you love me?" And St. Peter says, "Yes." And Jesus replies, "Feed my sheep." This is his invitation into voluntary self-sacrifice out of the love between Jesus and St. Peter. Now remember, the setting for this story is just after the first Easter, but before Ascension and Pentecost. The disciples have been twiddling their thumbs, wondering what to do when St. Peter has the bright idea to return to his old job of fishing with Andrew, with James and John, to go make some money at his job. So what does a life of voluntary self-sacrifice look like? Well, Acts 12 gives us a glimpse. This is Peter's third arrest at this point in the story. And this one by King Herod seems a lot more serious than the others by the temple authorities. In fact, Peter is chained between two guards, more or less in his underwear on a cold night, just to be mean. And the arrest is following the execution of St. James, John's brother and Peter's old business partner. Things look pretty grim for Peter in the moment. We also get a snapshot of St. Paul's life of voluntary self-sacrifice, a life poured out as an offering, he says. And so here at the end of his life, he mentions his trials at the hand of the Jerusalem authorities that results in him being sent to Rome for trial before the emperor. We remember Paul's famous list of hardships there in 2 Corinthians, the shipwrecks and the floggings and the starvation. But we also remember his letter to young Pastor Timothy, and how St. Paul raised up leaders everywhere he went so the gospel would continue uninterrupted and in purity, including leaders like St. Linus, who eventually leads the church in Rome after both Peter and Paul's executions. But the point here is not their deaths, even their travels or their imprisonments, but how both lived a life, an adventuresome life in pursuit of the gospel, in pursuit of joining Jesus on his mission. They fixed their eyes, their wills up on something higher than themselves, as it's phrased in today's gospel, feeding Jesus' sheep. And rather than settling down, keeping their heads down, paying down their bills so they can keep up with the Joneses in that hamster wheel of life, these guys find themselves all in with Jesus' self-sacrificial love for them, for the world, for you and for me. It results in an unconventional life, sure, as we sang in the first hymn, but surely that beats old Henry David Thoreau's observation of lives of quiet desperation common to the mass of men and women. Now, you've heard me say many times before that God lets nothing stand between him and us. That's the heart of the incarnation, when God doesn't even let the distance between the Creator and his creation stand, as he enters his own creation as a man. His will for us is love, and his invitation for us is to be loved and to love. He doesn't expect us to travel off to far-off places or necessarily to risk our necks in shipwrecks and jail as such, as a matter of course. His will is the same. His will is that the same faith that takes hold of him and of his gifts of forgiveness, new life, and salvation, that same faith will love with his own love. A life that's dedicated, offered up, and sacrificed freely, willingly, and voluntarily in this way is filled with the power of Jesus' endless life. It overcomes that quiet desperation of Thoreau. It feeds Jesus' sheep. It is poured out, as St. Paul writes. It's a life that shares what it has with others, as freely as it received forgiveness and new life and salvation. Grace, mercy, and love. Indeed, it shows the way. It tells the truth. It lives on God's terms. It sows peace and reconciliation as it thirsts for righteousness and mercy. In fact, imagine just picking one of those and pursuing it all the way at all times and all places. And if you don't think that you'll see an entirely new side of life and living opened up to you, a richer one even, well, all I can say is, what have you got to lose? Selfishness? Sinfulness? Carelessness? Aimlessness? Broken relationships? Alienated friends and relations? Discord among your coworkers? All because we're afraid of losing our own spot on that hamster wheel of life in the rat race? Losing our coping mechanisms and bad habits? Betraying our own negative self-worth? So that's what looking out for number one, looking out for ourselves, really looks like in the end. Lift up your eyes, up past your circumstances toward God, to see that he's already come down to you, to see that his will is love, to accept his love, to join him in his love that overflows from his life into your life, and from your life into the lives of others. Amen.